There is something about Wyoming Territory in the summer of 1876 that pulled broken people westward like moths to a distant lamp. The land didn't promise comfort. It didn't promise ease. It promised space, enough space to disappear into, or enough space to finally figure out who you were when no one from your old life was watching. Two people were about to find that out. But first, before the beginning, you need to see the end of something. June 1876, 11 o'clock at night, somewhere on a road that didn't have a name yet, deep in the belly of Wyoming Territory. The rain came sideways, not the gentle kind, the kind the old-timers called mountain rain, thick and relentless, the kind that soaked through wool and leather and settled in your bones for days. The kind of rain that turned simple roads into something closer to rivers of mud. A man sat on horseback, moving slowly but not stopping. His face was the first thing you noticed. The right side from temple down to jaw had gone the color of a bruised plum. His lower lip was split at the corner. His left forearm was wrapped in a strip of burlap sacking, the kind you'd use if you didn't have anything better and you needed anything to hold a wound together on a long road. Mud had crept up past his boot tops. His coat was so wet it had gone heavy and dark. In his right hand, cradled carefully the way a man holds something he knows is fragile but refuses to put down, was a sunflower. It had been yellow once. Now the petals had curled inward and browned at the edges. 3 days of rain and road, and one night of sleeping it on cold ground had taken most of the brightness out of it. But it was still whole, still held together, still in his hand. He didn't look down at it. He didn't look behind him. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, on the dark that his horse moved through one steady step at a time. There is something about a man who keeps going when everything around him says stop. Not the loud kind of courage, not the kind that announces itself with speeches or gestures. The quiet kind. The kind that doesn't need an audience. The kind that just keeps moving in the rain because he made a promise, and a promise meant something even when keeping it cost more than he'd budgeted for. 40 miles ahead of him was a train station in Laramie. And at that train station, or at least he hoped she was still, there was a woman he had never met. A woman he had written 12 letters to. A woman who had written 11 letters back, each one sharper and more honest than the last. A woman who had traveled from Boston, Massachusetts to a territory she had never seen based on nothing more than 12 letters, and the belief that a man who wrote with that kind of directness was probably also a man who meant what he said. He was 4 days late. He didn't know if she had waited. But he kept going. His name was Everett Wade. Most people called him Ev. He was 35 years old, and he was trying with everything he had left to be a man who deserved what he was riding toward. This is a story about what happens when two people decide to keep a promise when nothing is easy anymore. And I want to tell it to you because I think there's something in it that you recognize. Cut to Laramie, Wyoming Territory, June 10, 1876. 4 days earlier. The eastbound train arrived at 11:17 in the morning. Ada Merritt stepped off the second car with her leather traveling trunk in her right hand and $4.30 in the inside pocket of her coat. She knew the exact amount. She had counted it that morning in her sleeping compartment before the train pulled into the station, running the coins through her fingers the way her father had taught her to think through a problem carefully without flinching, starting with what was true instead of what you wished were true. $4.30, 2 nights in a decent hotel, or 1 night in a telegraph to Boston asking her sister for emergency funds. Not both. She knew what the money meant. She didn't pretend otherwise. The station at Laramie was smaller than she'd expected and louder than she'd hoped. The platform was crowded with the particular chaos of a frontier depot, men in trail-worn coats, women with children attached to both hands, the heavy smell of coal smoke mixed with something raw beneath it, something animal and dry that she couldn't quite name yet. The sun was already climbing toward a height that didn't allow for shadows. June sun in Wyoming was not like June sun in Boston. It was flatter somehow, more committed. It lay across the platform and the wooden buildings and the endless stretch of pale grass beyond, like it had no intention of moving. Ada set her trunk down at the edge of the platform and looked. No brown vest, no sunflower, no man standing the way a man stands when he is waiting for someone specific. She had read his description in his 4th letter. He had written it the way a man writes when he is not trying to impress anyone, simply, I will be wearing my brown wool vest, and I will be holding a sunflower, so you know which one I am. A practical detail. She had appreciated that. The brown wool vest was not on the platform. She noted this the way her father had taught her to note a patient's symptoms without rushing to conclusions, without panic, without the comfort of false reassurance. He is not here. That is the fact. That's it. Everything else is speculation. The trunk's leather carrying strap had come loose at the buckle. When she stepped down from the train car, she had felt it give under her hand, the brass fitting, twisting sideways under the weight. She didn't call for help. She set the trunk down carefully on the platform boards, sat down beside it, not kneeling, not crouching, sitting upright, with her back straight, the way her mother had insisted on, and her father had secretly admired, and opened the small sewing kit she kept in her coat pocket. Needle already threaded. She had learned years ago to keep it threaded. You never knew. 4 minutes, maybe 5. The station manager walked towards her from the far end of the platform, apparently intending to offer assistance. He stopped when he saw she was already finishing the repair. She looked up at him briefly, acknowledged him with a nod, and stood. She picked up the trunk. The strap held. She walked to the station office and asked about telegrams addressed to Ada Merritt. The man behind the counter checked without being asked twice, which she appreciated. Nothing. She thanked him. She walked outside and began asking questions. This was the first thing you needed to understand about Ada Merritt. She did not wait passively for information to arrive. She went and got it. By noon, she had spoken to the station manager, the man who ran the dry goods store across the street, and 2 women waiting for the westbound connection. None of them knew Everett Wade by name. Silver Creek Ranch, she was told by the dry goods man, was somewhere to the northwest, a day and a half by wagon. If the roads were clear, longer if they weren't. Nothing helpful, nothing she could act on yet. She found a hotel. She paid for 1 night and she began to think. The second day, Ada found Margaret Elam. It was the station manager who mentioned her, not exactly a recommendation, more the way you mention a landmark when someone is trying to navigate unfamiliar country. There's a woman named Elam runs a boarding house on the far side of town. She knows everyone worth knowing and a fair few who aren't. Margaret Elam was 54 years old and had the particular quality of someone who had stopped pretending about things a long time ago, not in a bitter way, but in the way of a person who had simply run out of patience for performances. She answered her. The front door, looked at Ada the way you look at a piece of furniture you are considering whether to buy, and said, "Have you eaten? Come in. Not tell me your story. Not what are you doing here alone. Not are you all right. Just have you eaten? Come in." Ada understood that language. Her father had spoken it. The language of practical care that doesn't need explanation. She went in. That evening at the long table in Margaret Elam's dining room, she met Leander Yates. He was 59, a freight hauler who ran supply routes across the territory, and he had the kind of face that had been weathered into something almost architectural, all angle and patience, the face of a man who had spent decades reading weather and road conditions and the reliability of other men's promises. He was passing through Laramie on his way back from a delivery run north. He sat across from Ada and asked her directly what she was doing, waiting at the Laramie station, and she told him because there was no point in being indirect about it. When she said the name Everett Wade, something shifted in Leander Yates's expression. Not surprise. Recognition. "Ev Wade, Silver Creek. Yeah, I know him." He picked up his coffee. 8 years I've been running freight to that ranch. Not once has he paid late. Not once has he missed a scheduled delivery. I've seen him ride 15 miles in a hailstorm to make sure a delivery got signed for because he'd told someone it would be there and he wasn't going to let a storm make him a liar. He paused. If Everett Wade told you he'd be here, he'll be here. Something's holding him up. The Platte's been running high. I heard reports of flooding on the northern roads 2 days back. If he was coming from that direction, he left the rest of it unfinished. He didn't need to finish it. Ada sat with that information the way she had learned to sit with a diagnosis, not rushing to comfort herself with it, not dismissing it, just letting it exist alongside the facts she already had. He has a record of keeping his word. There is a plausible reason for delay. Those two things together were not certainty, but they were something. They were enough to shift the calculation even slightly in a different direction. She didn't sleep much that second night, but she slept more than she had the night before. The third day cost her more than she wanted to admit. Not the money, though. By the end of it, the $4.30 had become considerably less. She had arranged to stay at Margaret's boarding house in exchange for help in the kitchen, which solved the immediate problem with the kind of practical grace Ada appreciated. She wasn't proud. Pride was a luxury for people whose situations weren't precarious. The money wasn't the problem. The problem was the space that opened up in the long hours of the afternoon when she had no task to focus on and no new information to pursue, and there was nothing to do but sit with the possibility that she had miscalculated. She had read his letters 12 times, not 12 total, 12 times through the entire sequence, start to finish, looking for the places where the language was careful in a way that might mean something was being hidden, or where the description of his circumstances didn't quite add up to what he was presenting. She had been thorough. She had been analytical. She had decided, based on everything she could observe from those letters, that Everett Wade was a man who told the truth, even when the truth was inconvenient. She had staked her fare to Wyoming on that conclusion. It was possible she was wrong. She had been wrong before. Not often. She was a careful thinker, and she knew it, but the record of her wrongness existed, and on the third afternoon in Laramie, it made itself known. What she did with that feeling was this: she didn't give it more space than it had earned. She went to the kitchen and started the evening meal without being asked, and she let the familiar work of chopping and stirring occupy the part of her mind that wanted to spiral, and she waited for the feeling to pass or the situation to change. That night, after Margaret had gone to bed, Ada sat alone at the small table in her room and took the pocket watch out of her coat. It was silver, worn smooth at the edges from years of being carried and handled. Her father's. The face was simple black numerals on white, no ornamentation, no flourish. The kind of watch a man bought because he needed to know the time, not because he wanted to be admired for his watch. It had stopped at 11:43 in the morning on a Tuesday in April 2 years ago. She had not wound it since. She was not yet ready to explain why. Even to herself, she only knew that the stopped hands felt in some way she couldn't fully articulate, like the right kind of honesty about something that had ended. She set it down and opened the bundle of his letters from her trunk and found the ninth one. She had marked them by cornerfold, the way her father had taught her to mark pages worth returning to. "I have been alone long enough to learn the difference between lonely and alone," he had written. His handwriting was not elegant. It was the handwriting of a man who had learned to write late, and by necessity each letter formed with deliberate care rather than natural ease. Lonely is wanting someone. Alone it is having learned not to want anymore. I am somewhere between those two things right now, and I'm not sure which one I'm more afraid of. She had read that paragraph the first time with her breath held. She had read it again and understood why she had written back. She folded the letter, put the watch down on the table, and spoke quietly to the empty room. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow is the last day." Not a threat, not a declaration, just the truth spoken aloud so it was real. She would give him one more day. She wasn't sure, if she examined herself honestly, whether that was faith or stubbornness. In her experience, those two things were sometimes hard to tell apart. He found her on the 14th of June, a Tuesday, at 12 minutes past noon. Ada was in Margaret's kitchen peeling potatoes. Not because she had been asked to, because she needed something to do with her hands, something that required just enough attention to keep the worst of her thoughts at bay without demanding so much that she couldn't also be listening. Margaret appeared in the kitchen doorway. She didn't say much. She rarely did when fewer words would do. "Someone at the depot asking for you." Ada put down the knife. She did not run. She walked quickly, faster than her usual pace. She knew that she couldn't entirely help it, but she walked. She came out of the side door of the boarding house and went up the street toward the station at a pace that was almost but not quite running, and she made herself keep it at that almost. Because if she ran, she would be showing him and herself that she had been waiting with her whole heart. And that was true. But it was the kind of truth that wanted to be offered, not taken. She came around the corner to the station platform and stopped. He was standing at the far end of the platform with his back to her. She could see enough tall broad through the shoulder, a coat that had been expensive once, and was now just functional mud on his boots that went past the ankle. When he heard her footsteps on the wooden boards and turned, she saw the rest. The bruising had settled into the right side of his face, purple-yellow from temple to jaw. His lower lip had a cut at the corner, dried now. His left forearm was wrapped in burlap, and though he held it without any obvious sign of pain, the wrapping was careful in the way that it suggested the injury underneath wasn't trivial. His hat was the same brown as the coat, and he held it in his left hand by the brim rather than wearing it. In his right hand, held upright carefully, was a sunflower. It was mostly dead. The petals had curled inward and gone the color of old paper at the edges. It had been a vibrant yellow alive thing at some point in the last week, and the road from Silver Creek Ranch to Laramie had done what roads do to things that aren't built to survive them. But he had kept it. He had kept it through 3 days of travel and rain, and she was realizing now, looking at his face, at least one encounter that had left its mark on him physically. He had kept it because he had said he would bring a sunflower so she could recognize him, and so he had brought a sunflower in the condition it was in because the promise was the thing. She stopped 10 feet away from him. The platform between them was empty. His eyes moved from her face to the trunk by her feet, then back to her face. She watched him take a breath. "You're Ada Merritt, from Boston." Not a question. He had the voice she'd somehow expected, not loud, not performing anything, just certain. "I am." She kept her eyes level. She let herself look at the bruising without looking away from it. "And you're 4 days late." "I know." He held out the sunflower. The gesture was simple and completely without flourish, the way you hand someone something that belongs to them. "I'm sorry the flower isn't what it should be, and I'm sorry you had to wait. Not I'm sorry I was late. Not I'm sorry for the inconvenience. I'm sorry you had to wait." As though the thing that mattered was her experience of the 4 days, not his explanation of them. She took the sunflower. It was lighter than it looked, nearly weightless the way dried things are, the water gone out of them. She held it and looked at him and let herself decide in the space of a few seconds what she thought of a man who had carried a dead flower 400 miles through bad weather because he'd said there would be a flower. "Sit with me," she said. "Tell me what happened. Then I'll decide." He sat. He told her about the flooding on the northern route, the Platte running 4 feet over its banks for 2 days, the detour east, that added time and miles both. That was true, and she could see it was true in the way he described it, the specific details of a man reporting what actually happened rather than what made a good story. Then he paused in the way a man pauses when he's deciding whether to say the next thing, and he said it. He had stopped one night in a town called Granger, not because the road required it, because he had sat in a roadside tavern with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him, and for about 2 hours he had been a man who was seriously considering turning around. "Not because I'd changed my mind about wanting to be here," he said. He was looking at the platform boards, not at her, and there was something in that, the way a man avoids your eyes when he's saying the truest thing he has, because the truest things don't survive being looked at too directly. "Because I was afraid that when you actually saw all of it, it wouldn't be what you'd agreed to." She looked at him for a moment. "But you kept going." "I kept going." "Then have dinner with me tonight." She held the dried sunflowers steady in her hands. "Both of us across a table telling the truth. After that, I decide." He met her eyes for the first time since sitting down. Held them. "All right," he said. "I'll tell the truth." The restaurant was small and warm and smelled of wood smoke and something roasting slowly. They sat across from each other at a table near the back, away from the door, with a candle between them that guttered slightly whenever anyone moved through the room. Ada went first. She told him her terms the way she might have told a colleague, her professional requirements, not softening them, not apologizing for them, not presenting them as negotiable when they weren't. Respect for what she was capable of. Honesty even when honesty was inconvenient. Time she would not be rushed toward things she wasn't ready for. These were not requests. They were the conditions under which she was willing to be a partner. She watched him listen. He was good at listening, and the kind of good that's rare, that involves actual stillness, not just waiting for his turn to speak. When she finished, he didn't respond immediately. He sat with what she'd said for a moment. "Then I understand." Simple. No qualification. No but. "Now I need to tell you 2 things that weren't in any of my letters. When I'm done, if you want to take the morning train back to Boston, I'll buy the ticket." No argument. She put her hands flat on the table. "Tell me." The first thing, he had a daughter, 7 years old. Her name was Nell. Her mother, his wife Grace, had died in 1869 from complications after Nell's birth. He had been out with the herd when it happened. He had come home and Grace was gone, and Nell was alive, and he had been raising Nell alone for 7 years with help from the neighbors and the weight of something he didn't name, But that sat in everything he said about that time. He had not put Nell in any of the letters because he had been afraid, not of the truth itself, but of the sequence. Write it in the first letter and no one writes back. He had not written it. He knew that was a failure of nerve, and he was not excusing it. She's 7, he said. She's smart. She's going to test you. Ada looked at him. That's her right. Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not surprise exactly, more like the careful relaxing of something that had been held very tight. The second thing, he set his hands on the table. Work-roughened hands, the knuckles large, the skin across the back of them creased by years of cold and sun. The ranch is in a legal dispute. A land speculator from Denver named Victor Crane has been filing claims against the water rights on Silver Creek for 2 years. It goes to court in 6 weeks. If he wins, the ranch loses its water source for the cattle. If the ranch loses its water, the ranch fails, Ada said. Yes. She looked at the candle. 2 years of legal fees bleeding the finances. A court date 6 weeks out. A 7-year-old girl who was going to test her. A man sitting across the table from her who had come 4 days late and bruised and carrying a dead flower rather than not come at all. She thought about those 12 letters. She thought about the 9th one. She thought about what it meant that he had told her these things not in his letters, where he could have controlled the presentation, but here across a table where he had to watch her face while the information landed. There's something I didn't put in my letters either, she said. He waited. She told him about the dozens of advertisements she had answered before his, the careful assessments she had made of each response, the particular thing she was looking for that she couldn't quite name until she read his first letter and understood what it was. He was the only one who had asked in any of them what she needed. Not what he was offering, not what he required, what she, Ada Merritt, needed from a life that was worth building. That's why I chose you, she said. Not because the other things were good, because of that. He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into the breast pocket of his vest and took something out and set it on the table between them. A ring. Gold thin, worn smooth with age, the kind of smooth that comes from decades of being carried in a pocket and handled and thought about. Simple. No stone, no inscription visible from where she sat. My mother's, he said. Not expensive, but it is real. She looked at the ring for a long moment. Then she looked at him. You understand I didn't come here for a romance. I didn't advertise for one. She put her hand over the ring, not taking it, not picking it up, just resting her hand over it on the table. Tomorrow, she said, before we leave. The justice of the peace was a practical man who seemed to find no particular incongruity in performing a marriage ceremony at 8:15 on a Thursday morning for 2 people who had met 20 hours earlier. He had Ada suspected seen stranger things. Margaret Elam wore her good dress, which was navy blue, and had been pressed sometime in the last year. Leander Yates stood beside her hat in his hands and had the expression of a man who found the occasion unexpectedly moving and was doing his best not to show it. Ev wore a clean shirt and his brown vest, which Ada had not seen on him until that morning, and which looked exactly as he had described it in his letter. She noticed this. She thought it meant something about a man that he described himself accurately. She wore her second-best dress, the green wool with the ivory buttons, because it was the most practical of the 3 good dresses she'd packed, and she was going to need the others to remain in good condition for longer. The words were short. They had both requested that. The judge read the form language about honor and fidelity and the obligations of the married state, and they repeated what they were meant to repeat, and Ev took the ring from his vest pocket and placed it on her finger. It fit. She had not expected it to fit. It fit the way things fit when you are not looking for signs, but you notice them when they appear. You may kiss the bride, the judge said. Ev looked at her. The question was there in his eyes, plain and uncomplicated. She gave him the smallest nod. He leaned in and kissed her, brief, careful, without any of the performance that the occasion might have licensed, the way a man seals an agreement that he intends to honor. They stepped outside into the morning light. She stood on the wooden sidewalk in front of the Justice of Peace's office with a ring on her finger and her name for the first time in her life newly changed, and she was Ada Wade. And she looked down on the main street of Laramie at the mountains in the distance that she was going to be living near for the rest of her life. She was 23 years old. She had come to a territory she had never seen for a man she had never met, and the man had arrived bruised and late, and carrying a dead flower, and had sat across from her and told her the hardest things about his situation because he thought she deserved to know them before she decided. She thought about her father, about what he had taught her, not just the medicine, not just the careful observation, but the thing underneath all of it, the principle that held everything else together. The truth is almost never as dangerous as you think it is. It's the hiding that kills you. She had found a man who seemed to understand that. She was not foolish enough to call it certainty. It was not certainty. It was a beginning, and a beginning was what it was. Ev came to stand beside her. He didn't take her hand. He stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the morning air, and he looked at the same mountains she was looking at. "Ready," he said. She looked at the mountains for another moment. The sunflower was in her coat pocket. She had put it there this morning without quite deciding to, and now it was there, the dried weight of it against her hip. "Ready," she said. They left Laramie the next morning, June 16th, before the heat came up. The wagon was loaded, the road went northwest. The mountains that had been distant the day before began to come closer. Ada Wade was going home. She didn't know yet what that meant. She didn't know about the ranch, or the girl who was waiting, or the court date, or the long evenings by lamplight, or the things that were going to break and need fixing, or the things that were going to hold in ways she hadn't expected. She knew the road was going northwest, and the man beside her had kept his word, when keeping it was hard, and the ring on her finger was thin and worn and real. Sometimes at the beginning of something worth having, that is exactly enough. The road northwest out of Laramie was not what Ada had expected. She had expected desolation. She had grown up reading accounts of the Western Territories in her father's study journals and survey reports, and the occasional letter from patients who had gone west and written back with the kind of detail that suggested they were trying to convince themselves as much as their correspondent that they had made the right choice. Those accounts described emptiness, barrenness, a landscape that swallowed people whole and left no record of them. What she found instead was scale, not emptiness scale. The difference mattered. Emptiness implied absence. This was presence, venipation. The sky went on so long in every direction that it ceased to feel like a ceiling and became instead something you moved through, something with weight and texture and intention. The grass stretched from the wheel ruts of the road to the base of the mountains in a continuous, unbroken sweep, pale gold, in the early morning light, shifting in the wind the way the surface of the ocean shifts, never the same twice, never still. The mountains themselves were not distant decoration. They were participants. You could feel them from 30 miles away. Ev drove the wagon. Ada sat beside him and looked at everything and said relatively little, which was apparently acceptable, because he said relatively little too. And the silence between them was not the uncomfortable kind, not the silence of two people who don't know what to say to each other, but the silence of two people who are both paying attention to the same thing and don't feel the need to narrate it. This was the first useful thing she learned about him on the road. He was a man who could be quiet without making you feel the quiet as a judgment. The second useful thing she learned was that he noticed more than he let on. He handed her the canteen before she thought to ask for it. He adjusted the wagon's course around a section of rutted road before she could feel it, which meant he had seen it and calculated the correction in the same motion. When a hawk came low over the wagon late in the first afternoon and Ada turned to watch it, he let the horses slow without her having to ask, giving her the time she was apparently taking without comment or impatience. He took care of things without announcing that he was taking care of things. That was the pattern she was beginning to see. The first night they camped on the open ground where the road bent west. 2 bedrolls, 2 sides of the fire. No explanation offered and none required. Ada lay on her back and looked at a sky so thick with stars it seemed structural, like something load-bearing, and thought about what her sister would say if she could see her now sleeping on the ground in Wyoming territory, the night after her wedding, and almost smiled. "I've never seen that many stars," she said. She hadn't meant to say it out loud. It came out anyway. He was quiet for a moment. "Boston has lights. Out here there's just the dark and whatever's in it." A pause. "You'll learn to like the dark. Or learn to live with it. Either works." She fell asleep faster than she'd expected. The second day the mountains came closer. The third day they crossed a creek shallow and quick, the water so clear she could see every stone on the bottom, and the road began to climb slightly, And in the late afternoon, Ev turned the wagon around a long curve of willows and juniper, and Silver Creek Ranch came into view. She saw it before he said anything. The house was low and long, built from pine logs gone gray, with weathering, with a stone chimney at the near end, trailing a thin thread of smoke into the afternoon air. A barn stood behind it, larger than she'd expected, with a fence line running south and east that disappeared into the landscape with the confidence of something that had been built to stay. The creek itself curved past the back of the property, catching the late sun's silver in a way that made the name make sense the moment you saw it. It was not beautiful in the way she had imagined beauty, not soft, not curated, not arranged for anyone's admiration. It was beautiful the way a well-made tool is beautiful. The way something is beautiful when it has been built exactly for what it needs to do and has been doing that thing reliably for years. Someone had washed the window curtains recently. She could see them through the glass, a lighter white than they would have been if they'd been hanging unwashed for months. The front step had been swept. A small clay pot sat on the windowsill to the right of the door with a dried bundle of sage in it. She turned to look at him. "You did this before you came to get me." He kept his eyes on the horses. "You deserve to walk into a clean house." She looked back at the house for a moment, thought about a man riding 400 miles, battered and late, who had still thought to wash the curtains before he left. On the far side of the yard, a family she didn't know yet was standing near the fence, a man and a woman and two older children who had apparently been watching over the property while Ev was away. And between them and the fence, standing slightly apart with her arms crossed and her head at the particular angle of a child who was doing a careful and thorough assessment, was a girl, 7 years old. Dark hair and two uneven braids that she had clearly done herself, the left one tighter than the right, the part not quite straight. Brown eyes the color of creek-washed walnut, the kind of dark that catches light differently depending on the angle. She was wearing a dress that had been let out at the hem recently, the old hemline still faintly visible, which meant she had grown and someone had tried to keep up with it. She was looking at Ada the way a very intelligent 7-year-old looks at something she has not yet decided how to categorize. "Pa said you were a teacher," she said, not a greeting, an opening statement in what was clearly going to be a proceeding. "I was." Ada did not crouch down to meet her eye level. She had learned in 5 years of teaching that crouching could read as condescension if the child in question was smart enough to notice it. She looked down at her directly instead. "And you're Nell?" "Yes." The girl held her gaze for a moment, then said with the directness of someone who had decided that hedging was inefficient, "My mother's name was Grace." "I know. You're not her." "I'm not," Ada said. "I'm Ada." Nell looked at her for one more beat, the kind of look that is actually a calculation, and then turned and walked to her father and wrapped both arms around his middle without looking back. Ev put one hand on the top of her head and held her there briefly, his eyes over her braids on something in the middle distance. Ada stood in the yard of her new home and understood two things at once. The first was that nothing about this was going to be simple. The second was that the girl's directness, however uncomfortable, was honest, and honesty, even the uncomfortable kind, was something Ada knew how to work with. She picked up her trunk and carried it inside. The first week passed in the way that first weeks pass when you are learning a language you didn't know you'd need, slowly at first, then in sudden lurches of comprehension. She learned the geography of the ranch by walking it, where the fence lines ran and why, which section of pasture the cattle preferred in the morning and which they drifted toward by afternoon. The particular sound Silver Creek made when the water level was normal versus when it was low, a distinction Ev explained to her on the second morning, in the way he explained most things, by showing rather than telling, standing at the bank and letting her hear the difference. She learned to read the western sky the way he read it, the color of the clouds at the horizon, when weather was building, the quality of the light in late afternoon that preceded a cold night. These were not things she could have learned from a book. They required the kind of attention that comes from necessity. She learned the livestock, each animal individually, which Ev clearly thought it was an unusual approach, but did not discourage. She learned which horses were reliable and which required watching, which cow was likely to wander, which of the calves had been sickly in the spring. She filed all of it in the same organized way she had filed information in her father's medical notes, not randomly, but in relationship to other things, so that each fact pointed to other facts. On the fourth day, she noticed one of the younger calves favoring its left foreleg. She saw it in the morning during the first check of the pasture, and she watched the animal for 20 minutes before she went to get Ev. When she did, she described what she'd seen, precisely the specific way the leg was carried, the degree of favor, the absence of obvious swelling, the way the animal was still eating normally, which suggested the issue was localized rather than systemic. Ev listened. He came and looked. He confirmed what she'd identified and added one detail: she'd missed a small cut at the pastern, barely visible in the grass length. He took care of the wound. Ada was already preparing the necessary materials by the time he needed them. He didn't say anything when she handed him what he needed before he asked for it. But later, when she was coming back from the creek with a bucket of water, and she happened to look back at him, he was standing at the fence with one hand on the top rail, looking at nothing in particular. The look on his face was not the look of a man reviewing his accounts or planning the afternoon's work. It was the look of a man who has seen something that adjusted something else quietly without announcement. She turned back to the creek and kept walking. That evening, he found a loose board on the back step and fixed it without mentioning that he'd found it. Ada heard the sound of the hammer from the kitchen window and understood, without needing any translation, that the language they were both speaking was not made of words. With Nell, she tried nothing strategic. Strategy with a 7-year-old who was as alert as this one would have been detected and resented. Ada had spent 5 years teaching children, and the primary thing she had learned was that children, particularly intelligent children, have very accurate instruments for detecting adults who are performing for them, rather than simply being present with them. So she did not perform. She made 2 cups of cocoa in the morning, one for herself and one that she set on the kitchen table at a height Nell could reach without comment or invitation. She read aloud from a book she had brought from Boston Dickens, because her father had read Dickens to her, and she had loved it, and because the rhythms of it were good for reading aloud in the evenings after supper, not looking at Nell, while she read, just reading to the room. The first evening, Nell sat at the far end of the room and looked at her hands. The second evening, she sat on the floor near the fireplace with her back to the room, ostensibly occupied with a piece of knotted string she was working at. But the knot remained unworked. The third evening, she came and sat in the chair nearest the lamp and listened with the expression of someone who has decided not to admit they are interested. Ada turned a page and kept reading. She never touched the room that had been Grace's, the small bedroom that Nell used and that still had. Ada could see through the doorway on the mornings the door was open, the particular arrangement of objects that belongs to a child who is curating a specific kind of memory. A quilt in a pattern Ada didn't know the name of. A small wooden horse on the windowsill. Things that were not Ada's to move or rearrange or improve. She understood this without being told. It was the end of the second week when Nell got sick. Ada woke to the sound of coughing, not the brief incidental kind, but the sustained productive cough of a child whose body is working hard at something. She was out of bed and down the hall before she had fully decided to move. The door to Nell's room was already open by the time she reached it. Ev was standing in the doorway, one hand on the frame. He was fully dressed. He had not been asleep or had woken faster than she had, and he was looking at his daughter in the bed with the expression of a man who knows every competent thing to do in a barn or a field or a legal dispute and does not know what to do here. The lamp on Nell's side table was already lit. Ada moved past him. She had the back of her hand against Nell's forehead before she had fully assessed the rest of the situation. Elevated temperature, not dangerous yet, but climbing. The cough was in the chest, productive, which meant the lungs were working properly. Eyes too bright. She had seen this before, the particular presentation of a child who had spent too many afternoons near cold water and not dried off quickly enough after. She went back to the kitchen without speaking, moved by lamplight, with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly what she needed and where to find it. Willow bark for the fever, a clean cloth. The small tin of camphor salve she had brought it from Boston in the same systematic way she had brought everything else that might be needed, not because she expected to need it, but because her father had taught her that preparation was not pessimism. It was respect for the unpredictability of things. When she returned to the room, Ev was sitting on the edge of the bed with one hand resting near Nell's arm, close enough to mean something, not touching, in the way of a man who does not know whether touching will help or disturb. He looked up when Ada came in. She set out what she'd brought, arranged it in the order she'd need it, and began. The camphor salve first worked carefully into the child's chest and throat. The willow bark steeped in warm water cooled to drinking temperature offered in small, measured amounts because a sick child's stomach protests at too much at once. A cloth wrung out and laid across Nell's forehead. Nell submitted to all of it with the passive cooperation of a child who feels bad enough to permit things she would ordinarily resist. Ev watched from the edge of the bed and did not get in the way and did not ask unnecessary questions. These were the two most useful things he could have done, and he did them without being told, which told Ada something. Around 2 in the morning, Nell's fever broke in the way fevers break, a sudden dampness at the hairline, a loosening of the rigid misery in her small face, and then the particular quality of sleep that is actual rest rather than the exhausted struggling the hours before had been. Ada sat back in the chair she had pulled to the bedside. Her hands were in her lap. The lamp had burned low. She looked up. Ev was still in the doorway. He had not moved to his own room. He had simply stayed at the threshold where he could see where he was not crowding the space she needed to work in. He was looking at his daughter's sleeping face with an expression that was not the fear of 2 hours earlier. It was something quieter, something that had been wound very tight for a long time and had, while he was not paying attention to it, released. He looked up and found Ada watching him. Neither of them said anything. He gave a small nod, the kind that means thank you in a language where thank you is too small a phrase for the thing being acknowledged. She returned it. He went to his own room. Ada sat for a while longer in the low lamplight, listening to Nell breathe in the easy, unhurried rhythm of a child who would be asking for breakfast by morning and would be mildly outraged by the memory of having been unwell. She did not know precisely what had shifted in the room that night. She only knew that something had, and that it had happened quietly without announcement, the way the most permanent things usually did. In the morning, Nell came to the kitchen table and found her cup of cocoa already there. She sat down, wrapped both hands around it, and said nothing. But before she drank, she looked at Ada across the table with eyes that were different from the ones that had assessed her in the yard 3 weeks before. Not open, not yet that, but somewhat less carefully shut. Ada poured her own coffee and said nothing either. There was nothing that needed saying. On the 5th day after Nell's recovery, Ada bought 6 chickens from the Dawson family who worked the neighboring property. She drove the wagon herself. Ev had watched her handle the reins for 2 days before she asked to take them, and after 40 minutes had simply handed them over and came back with a wooden crate in the wagon bed, making the sounds that a wooden crate makes when it contains 6 very opinionated chickens. She built a small enclosure for them near the barn, which required 20 minutes of fence repair, that she handled herself with wire and pliers from the barn, and she installed the chickens one at a time. Nell appeared from around the corner of the barn midway through this process. She watched silently for a moment. "Are you going to name them?" "Already have," Ada said, without looking up from the wire she was twisting. "This one's Mabel. That one's Bess. The black one at the back is Harriet. Pa says chickens are livestock. Your pa is right about most things." Ada set down the pliers. "Harriet still ought to have a name." Nell looked at Harriet. Harriet looked back with the profound indifference that is a chicken's primary social contribution. "What about the others?" Ada pointed them out in turn. The remaining 3 were Clara Josephine and the particularly aggressive one who had already attempted to assert dominance over the others twice during the transport and who she had named Mabel, after a woman she had briefly taught with in Boston, who had also been very short and very certain she was in charge of everything. "The one named Mabel," Nell said, watching the chicken in question attempt to climb over Josephine. "Seems difficult." "She knows what she wants," Ada said. "There's a difference." Nell considered this for a moment with the seriousness of someone genuinely weighing the distinction. Then she went back inside without another word. But that evening she sat in the chair nearest the lamp before Ada had even opened the book. The 8th of July began like the other mornings. Ada was in the kitchen garden at mid-morning. She had started it in the ground near the south wall the week before, working it into the rocky soil with a determination that the soil only partly matched when she heard the sound. It was a sharp crack, the kind that has a very specific character depending on what has broken. This one was wood under tension. Then a longer sound of sliding, and then an impact. Then nothing. The silence was the thing that made her move. She came around the barn at a run and went through the door and found him on the ground floor of the barn, on his back, one hand over his eyes against the dust and the shaft of light coming through the hole in the roof where he had been working. The third rung of the wooden ladder was on the ground beside him in two pieces. He was breathing. That was the first thing she checked, and it was regular, which reduced the immediate possibilities to a manageable number. He moved his hand from his face and looked up at her with the expression of a man who is in significant pain and is committing considerable effort to not showing it. Your left hand, she said. Can you move your fingers? He moved them. Good, not the arm. She knelt beside him and ran her hands along his right leg, the one that was lying at the angle she'd noticed the moment she came through the door. Not an angle the leg chose for itself. Her father had set 4 broken tibias in the years she had trained with him. She had assisted twice. She knew the presentation. Don't move, she said. I'm going to get the whiskey from the kitchen cabinet and what I need from your barn. Don't try to get up. The cattle are fine. They were fine 10 minutes ago and they'll be fine in an hour. Don't move. She went. She came back. She did what needed to be done. There is a kind of focus that her father had called clinical remove, not indifference to the person in front of you, not the erasure of the fact that you know them, but the capacity to set aside the emotional weight of that knowledge long enough to do the technical work correctly. He had told her once that it was the hardest thing to learn and the most necessary. You can grieve later, he'd said. Right now, the job is the job. She set the bone with both hands, one at the ankle, one at mid-calf, and felt it move back to where it was supposed to be. Ev made a sound through closed teeth that was not quite a word, pressed his head back against the floor and held very still. She respected that. She had respected it in patients before. The dignity of a person trying to stay in control of themselves when their body is doing the opposite. She splinted it with the 2 boards from the wood pile that were straight enough and bound the whole thing with strips from a length of canvas she found hanging in the barn. 6 weeks, she said, sitting back on her heels. No weight on it, no ladders, no negotiating with me about this. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. The ranch needs. Tell me what the ranch needs and I'll take care of it. That's not a performance. I mean it exactly. She looked at him steadily. Do you trust me to handle it? The pause was not long, but it was real. Yes, he said. She stood up and went to get the wagon to bring him inside. When she was gathering the tools she'd need, her coat caught on the edge of the barn door, and the pocket turned out, and her father's pocket watch fell to the ground. It landed face up in the dirt. The hands read 11:43 frozen there, as they always were, as they had been for 2 years. She picked it up and dusted it off and put it back in her pocket. She went back to the barn. It was only later when she was walking back across the yard with the wagon that she noticed Ev had picked up the watch from where it had fallen near him on the ground and set it carefully on the edge of the workbench so it wouldn't be stepped on. He hadn't asked about it. He had just moved it somewhere safe. She put it back in her pocket without comment. He had noticed. She filed that away alongside everything else. The 6 weeks that followed were the hardest and the most clarifying of Ada's life in the particular way that hard and clarifying tend to go together. She learned to work the ranch the way she had learned medicine, by doing it badly first, and then correcting and correcting again, and asking when she didn't know, and not pretending she knew things she didn't. There was no room out here for the kind of pride that values the appearance of competence over competence itself. The cattle didn't care whether she felt uncertain. The fences didn't care whether she'd had a good night's sleep. She did the morning checks at first light alone, in the pre-dawn quiet that smelled of creek water and pine, and something she was slowly learning to call morning here, which was distinct from morning anywhere else she had been. She repaired 2 sections of fencing that she identified as compromised before they failed. She managed the Dawson family's regular help with the efficiency of someone who has learned that efficient management of other people's time is itself a form of respect. She corresponded with the feed supplier and with the county assessor regarding the upcoming court date, reading through the legal files on Ev's desk with the same systematic approach she brought to her father's medical records. Every evening she sat in the chair beside his bed and told him what the day had been. He was a good listener in the particular way of people who have trained themselves to hear the information under the information, not just what you report, but what the reporting reveals about what you noticed and how you thought. He asked questions that were precise. He disagreed with her twice in the 6 weeks, both times correctly, and she revised her approach accordingly and didn't resent it because he wasn't asserting authority. He was contributing information she didn't have. She came to understand that the silence, which had seemed at first like withholding, was actually a form of respect. He didn't fill air with words unless the words were earning their place. When he did speak, it was because he had decided the words were necessary. This was, she thought, a quality she had not known she was looking for until she found it. One evening in the fourth week, he said without preamble, "You're managing better than I would have." She was looking down at the ledger she'd brought to show him the week's accounts. She kept her eyes on the page. Better or better than you expected? Both. She noted the entry she'd been making and closed the ledger. My father said the worst thing you can do is protect someone from information about their own situation. He meant it about patients. I think it applies more broadly. He was a doctor. He was a justice of the peace for 10 years, too. He thought the law and medicine had the same underlying problem, people in difficult circumstances trying to understand what was actually happening to them. She set the ledger on the side table. He was right about most things. Ev looked at the window where the light was going out of the sky in the way it did here all at once, then gradually, then suddenly dark. He sounds like someone worth learning from. He was. She said it in the present tense. She noticed that she had said it in the present tense. There was one afternoon somewhere in the fifth week that belonged to a different category of time than the rest of it. Ada was in the kitchen shelling beans from the kitchen garden when she heard the sound of Nell's voice in the yard, and then Ev's voice from the porch where he'd been sitting with the crutch she'd made him from a length of ash. She could hear only the rhythm, the quick rising pattern of a child making an official report, and the slower, lower pattern of a man receiving it with great effort not to react. She went to the window. Nell was standing in the yard with a handful of feed surrounded by 6 chickens who were managing to be simultaneously uninterested in her and completely focused on the feed. Harriet had positioned herself directly in front of Nell's left boot in a way that suggested a territorial claim. Ev from the porch with his splinted leg out in front of him and his hands around a coffee cup was doing the thing she had seen him do when he was trying not to react to something he found funny, going slightly still, the jaw setting at a particular angle that was the physical equivalent of a door being held closed from the inside. Ada came out of the kitchen. "Harriet laid more eggs than the others," Nell announced to her with the authority of someone delivering a scientific finding. "I counted, she's the best one." "She's assertive," Ada said. "Assertive animals often have better outcomes when conditions are competitive." Ev looked at Ada over Nell's head. "You're applying medical theory to chickens." "I'm applying observation to chickens. There's a difference." "Pa says the chickens are livestock," Nell offered again, as though reintroducing a point of law she felt had not been sufficiently addressed. "Your pa is correct," Ada said. "Harriet is also the best one." Nell looked between them both, apparently satisfied that this constituted a reasonable resolution, and went back to distributing feed with the deliberation of a child who takes her responsibilities seriously. Ev was looking at Ada with the expression she had come to associate with him finding something genuinely unexpected. Not warm exactly, not yet that, but something adjacent to it, something that existed in the same vicinity. "You named one after a woman you used to work with," he said. "She reminded me of her." It seemed accurate. "Is the real Harriet aware of this?" "The real Harriet moved to Philadelphia 4 years ago. I don't imagine the intelligence has reached her yet." He didn't smile, but the door stayed closed by a distinctly smaller margin than usual. Mabel chose that moment to steal a piece of bread directly from Nell's hand, which led to Nell issuing a rapid and thoroughly justified complaint, and the brief window of levity closed itself the way those windows do, quickly, cleanly, in the way of things that don't need to be prolonged to be complete. But it had been there, and they had both been in it. Later that afternoon, when the yard had gone quiet, and Nell was inside and the late sun was laying long across the grass, Nell found Ada at the fence and pulled her by the sleeve toward the barn without explanation. Inside, she pointed to the third rung of the wooden ladder, lying in 2 pieces on the ground, where it had been since the day Ev fell. Ada had been meaning to move it. She hadn't yet decided where. "I saw someone," Nell said, "the night before Pa fell, from my window." Ada kept her voice even. "Tell me." "A man, standing where the ladder was outside the barn door. It was dark. He went away." Nell paused. "I woke up early and came to look. The rung wasn't rotten. Pa keeps everything good. Rotten wood, Pa would have seen it." Ada picked up one of the broken pieces. She had looked at it before briefly in the immediate aftermath and filed the observation under noted return to later. She looked at it now with the complete attention it deserved. The break was clean, not the irregular fracture of wood that fails under stress after years of weathering. The edge was too uniform on one side, not all the way through, about 3/4, enough to hold for 1 or 2 steps then fail under full weight. She set the piece down carefully. Have you told your father? No, he'd worry. He worries worse when he can't do anything. Ada looked at this 7-year-old who had come to her not because she trusted her yet entirely, but because she had identified her as the person most likely to handle the information correctly. You're right that he worries worse when he can't act on it, Ada said. That's accurate. So what do we do? We wait until we can use what you saw effectively. She held Nell's gaze. Can you keep this between us until I say? Nell thought about it seriously. She was not a child who agreed to things without weighing them. Yes, she said, thank you. Ada said it the way she meant it, directly without diminishment. What you just told me is important. I want you to know that I understand that. Nell looked at her for a moment. Something in the brown eyes that had been measuring and withholding since the day Ada arrived in the yard became, if not open, then somewhat less carefully shut. She turned and went back to the house without further ceremony. Ada stood into the barn with the broken rung in her hands and thought about Victor Crane and about court dates and about a man who had been told that the surest way to win a legal dispute was to ensure there was no one left to contest it. Then she set the piece down where she could find it again, and she went back to the fence that still needed finishing. That evening, she sat by Ev's bed later than usual. He was reading from the legal file she had set out for him, the correspondence with the county court, the opposing counsel's filings, the land survey documents that she had been reviewing and annotating for the past 2 weeks. He looked up when she set a cup of coffee on the side table for him. There's something I want to ask you, she said. He set down the papers. The prior appropriation law, your right to the creek, it depends on when you first put the water to beneficial use. I've been using Silver Creek since I broke ground in '64. I know. I've read the homestead certificate. What I want to know is whether you have documentation from that period. Survey records, supply invoices, any correspondence with the county that would establish the date independently. He was quiet for a moment. There's a tin box in the top drawer of the desk. Everything from the first 3 years. I want to go through it. He looked at her in the lamplight with the expression of someone who is recalibrating. My lawyer hasn't asked for that. I know, she said. I've been reading your lawyer's filings. He's argued the date correctly, but he hasn't fully documented it. Crane's counsel is going to contest the establishment date. If we can show it corroborated across multiple independent documents. You read case law. My father was a justice of the peace for 10 years. I read what was on his desk. She looked at him steadily. Do I have your permission to work through the box, Marinha? He held her gaze for a moment, and there was something in his expression that had not been there in the first week. Something that existed just past respect and territory that didn't have a simple name yet. Yes, he said, whatever you need. She took the tin box from the desk. She sat in the chair by the window and began to read, and the lamp burned down slowly, and outside Silver Creek moved over its stones in the dark, and the night was very quiet. And somewhere in the third hour of that work, sitting in the lamplight of her own house with her husband's papers in her hands and her father stopped watch in her coat pocket, Ada Wade understood something she had not quite understood before. She had come here to find a situation worth building. She had not expected to find something she was afraid of losing. That was different. That was a different thing entirely. She sat with it for a long time before she put it away and went back to the papers, and the creek moved on outside, and the night finished itself in the ordinary way, and she let the feeling exist without trying to name it before she was certain what it was. There was time. There was still time. The court date was 3 weeks out. She had work to do. 3 weeks before the court date, she found him still awake at midnight. She had come out for water and seen the lamplight under his door, and she had paused in the hallway the way you pause when you are deciding whether to respect the privacy of someone's sleeplessness or whether the moment calls for something else. She stood there for a moment. The house was quiet around her, the particular quiet of a place where a child is sleeping, which is different from ordinary quiet, softer at the edges. She knocked once and opened the door. He was sitting up in bed with the legal files she had organized for him laid across the blanket, but he wasn't reading them. He was looking at the window, which showed nothing but dark, and he had the expression of a man who has been somewhere else entirely for some time. She came in and sat down in the chair beside the bed. She didn't ask what he was thinking about. She had learned enough about him to know that the asking would close it rather than open it. She picked up her father's pocket watch from the side table where she had left it earlier that evening when she'd been working through the tin box of documents, and she held it in her hands the way she always held it. Not looking at it, just holding it the way you hold something that is both very light and very heavy at the same time. He looked at it, then he looked at her. "It never runs," he said. "No." "How long?" She looked at the face of the watch. 2 years. He died at 11:43 on a Tuesday in April. She turned it over in her hands. "I was there. I was holding his hand. I had done everything correctly. The right medicine, the correct dosage, the proper positioning, the care you give someone in the final stage of something that doesn't intend to be stopped. And it wasn't enough." She paused. "He died anyway." Ev didn't say anything. He was listening in the way he listened, completely without interruption, without preparing a response. "The thing I have never said to anyone," she continued, and she said it the way she said things that were difficult, directly, without softening, because softening the hard things was her father's technique, and she had never fully mastered it and had long since stopped trying, "is that I didn't cry immediately. I checked his pulse. I wrote down the time. I closed the notebook. I straightened the blankets. I put the watch in my pocket. And then I went into the hallway and sat down on the floor and cried for a long time. And what I was crying about, at least partly, was the fear that I had become a person who couldn't cry at the right moment, that I had learned to work through things too efficiently, and somewhere in the process had lost the ability to simply feel them when I was supposed to." She stopped. Ev looked at his hands on the blanket. "I was in the South Valley," he said, "when Grace went into labor. 2 days' ride from the house. There was no way for anyone to reach me in time, and the Dawsons tried. Rode 4 hours to find me. When I got back—" He stopped, began again in the manner of a man who is not accustomed to narrating his own losses and is doing it anyway because the moment requires it. "When I got back, Grace was gone. Nell was alive. A neighbor woman had stayed and delivered the baby and done everything that could be done, which was considerable. Grace had been gone 3 hours by the time I walked through the door." The lamp guttered slightly, settled. "Nell looked at me from that blanket," he said. "She was 3 hours old, and she had Grace's eyes exactly, and I looked at her, and I didn't know, I still don't know, and it has been 7 years, and I have thought about it every single day of those 7 years, whether what I felt in that moment was love or grief or terror or all of them at the same time, in a proportion I couldn't separate. I only knew that she was alive, and Grace was not, and I was the one who had not been there." "You couldn't have been there." "I know that." "Then why are you saying—" "I know that," he said again, and there was something in the way he said it the second time, not sharp, not defensive, just exhausted in the way of something that has been known intellectually for years without being believed. "And I have known it since the Dawson boy told me what had happened, and that there was nothing anyone could have done differently. I have known it. It does not stop the knowing of the other thing." She understood this completely. She understood it the way you understand something that you have carried in your own body for years and never found language for, and then someone else says it and the language fits. "Is that true?" she asked. "That there was nothing to be done differently?" "Yes." "Then why do we believe the other thing?" He was quiet for a long time. "I don't know," he said. "That's the part I can't resolve." "I don't know either." She set the watch down on the side table. "I have applied every analytical approach I know to the question of whether I could have saved my father with different decisions at different points over the preceding years. And the answer is always no, and knowing the answer is no does not stop the question from forming." They sat in the quiet of that for a while. The lamp burned. The creek moved outside in the dark. In the room down the hall, Nell slept in the uncomplicated way of children who have worn themselves out with living. It was not a comfortable silence, but it was an honest one. And honest silences, Ada had learned, were worth more than comfortable ones, because comfortable silences could be maintained between strangers. This kind could not. Ev reached over slowly, slowly enough that it was clearly a decision, not a reflex, and picked up the pocket watch from the side table. He turned it over in his hands the way she had turned it over. Looked at the face, looked at her. "May I?" She looked at him for a moment. At his hands, which were the hands of a man who built and repaired things and did it carefully. At his face, which was doing nothing except asking. She nodded. He turned the watch over and found the winding crown at the side and began to wind it, slowly. The mechanism was stiff from 2 years of disuse and gave some resistance, and he worked through it carefully, not forcing it the way you treat something delicate that has been still for a long time. 3 turns. 4. The resistance eased. He set the watch back on the table face up. The second hand moved. It moved so quietly she almost didn't see it. Just the smallest incremental advance, the first tick of a mechanism returning from long suspension, and then another, and the second hand began its circuit of the face with the unhurried steadiness of something that has simply been waiting for someone to let it continue. 11:43. The time still read 11:43, but the hands were moving now. He lay back against the pillow without speaking. Ada looked at the watch for a long time, at the minute hand beginning its slow climb away from where it had stopped, at the quiet mechanical fact of the thing continuing. Her father had wound that watch every morning for 40 years. It had never in all those years been still. She had stopped it. She had decided, perhaps without deciding, that stopping it was the right kind of grief. But grief has a season, and the season ends, and the ending is not a betrayal. It is just the ending. She sat with that until she was sure of it. Then she picked up the files she had brought with her and set them on her lap and went back to work. And the watch kept time on the side table, and neither of them said anything else that night. They didn't need to. When she finally went back to her own room, well past midnight, she understood something she had been circling for weeks without landing on. The man in the other room was not a man she had agreed to tolerate. He was not a man she was learning to manage. He was a man she had been without noting the precise moment of transition, afraid of losing. That was a different thing. That changed the calculus of everything. She lay in the dark and let it be true, and outside Silver Creek moved on, and she fell asleep to the sound of it. The next morning she had another conversation with the broken ladder rung. She took it out of the barn in the early light and set it on the workbench with the good lamps lit, and she looked at it the way her father had taught her to look at evidence, without deciding what it meant before you'd seen everything it had to show you. She turned it in the light. She ran her thumb along the break. 3/4 through. Clean angle on one side, rougher on the other where it had finally given. A saw makes a particular kind of mark that a stressed wood failure does not. She had seen enough of both to know which this was. She wrapped it in canvas and put it with the court files. 2 days before the hearing, a wagon came up the road from the south. It was Leander Yates. He had heard not from Ada, but from the Dawson family, who had heard from the feed merchant in town, who had heard it in the way that news travels in small territories, through the gaps between things, rather than through any deliberate channel, that the Silver Creek water rights case was going to hearing, and that Ev Wade was on crutches, and that the case might be closer than it should be. He came with a ledger. 8 years of delivery records. Every trip to Silver Creek Ranch documented with date and weather and condition of road. The earliest entry, August 14th, 1864. Delivered to E. Wade Silver Creek claim. Creek running well water clear. 4 months after the homestead certificate date. Independent corroboration from a source with no interest in the outcome. Ada looked at that first entry and felt something release in her chest that she hadn't known was held. Thought it might be useful, Leander said. He was drinking coffee at the kitchen table, hat on his knee. It's more than useful, Ada said. Ev helped me move a load of timber out of a spring flood 6 years ago. Came out himself, he didn't bring anyone, didn't say anything about it later. He drank his coffee. I've been waiting to be useful back. The next morning, the Dawson family came with their own records. Tom Dawson had kept a farm journal since 1867, a practical man's diary of weather and water, and the small catastrophes of agricultural life, and Silver Creek appeared in it 37 times over 9 years, its level, its clarity, its seasonal character, the way it ran in drought years and flood years, and the ordinary years in between. The creek had been there in use consistently, in an independent record across a span that made Victor Crane's filing date look like an afterthought. Margaret Elam arrived from Laramie the evening before the hearing. She had driven the wagon herself, which was not unusual for Margaret. She came in, looked at the room full of people and papers and the particular organized tension of the night before, something important, and said, "Has anyone eaten?" And then went to the kitchen. Ev stood in the doorway of the main room and watched it all, the Dawson family at the table, Leander Yates going through delivery records with Ada Nell, asleep in her chair in the corner, with her head against the wall, a lamp burning on every flat surface. He stood there for a long time. He had the look of a man who is receiving something he wasn't prepared for. Ada came to stand beside him, not close enough to be conspicuous, just near. They came without being asked, he said, quietly, more to himself than to her. They came because it was their creek, too, she said, and because you helped Leander with the timber. And because Tom Dawson's wife told me you spent 2 days last winter helping them dig out after the roof collapse and wouldn't take any payment. She kept her eyes on the room. You've been here 12 years, Ev. You just never let anyone think you needed anything. He said nothing, but she saw his jaw move slightly in the way it moved when something was landing somewhere it wasn't expected to go. I'm glad you let me come, she said. Then she went back to the table and the records and left him with the moment. The hearing was held in the county courthouse in Laramie on the 22nd of July in a room that smelled of pine resin and dust, and the accumulated weight of official proceedings conducted in a building that was still too new to have its formality fully settled. Victor Crane arrived with 2 lawyers. They brought a surveying company's assessment, a set of maps drawn at considerable expense and considerable detail, and a prepared argument about the economic benefit of controlled water distribution for the territory as a whole. It was a professional presentation. Ada had been in the room 5 minutes before she understood that Crane had spent real money on this and had expected it to be sufficient. Ev brought Ada. He brought the documents in a canvas bag that he carried under his arm, the crutch under the other, moving across the courthouse floor with the particular economy of motion of a man who has decided that his own inconvenience is simply not the relevant factor today. Nell sat in the second row with Margaret Elam on one side of her and Leander Yates on the other, in the arrangement of someone who has been specifically placed where she can see clearly. She was wearing her good dress, the blue one which she had put on herself and done up herself, though the top 2 buttons were slightly misaligned, and she was sitting with her back completely straight in the way she sat when she was taking something seriously. Crane's lawyers presented their case with competence and confidence. The maps were good. The economic argument was coherent, controlled water allocation, irrigation infrastructure, stable supply for the valley, regardless of drought, year, or flood year. It was not a dishonest argument. It was an argument that had the quality of a thing that is true in the abstract and wrong in the specific, and that wrongness was what Ada had spent 3 weeks building the case to demonstrate. The judge looked across the table. Mr. Wade? Ev put 3 things on the table. The first was the original homestead certificate, issued April 3, 1864, signed by the appropriate federal officer. The language of the beneficial use claim was specific and unambiguous. The creek running through the northeast corner of the property was put to immediate use for livestock watering upon occupation of the land. The second was the accumulated documentary record, Leander Yates's delivery logs, Tom Dawson's farm journal, 2 additional neighbors' records, a letter from the county assessor dated 1868 referencing Silver Creek Ranch as an established operation with a functioning water supply. 12 years of independent corroboration assembled by different hands for different purposes, none of it created for this proceeding. The judge was a methodical man who read slowly and thoroughly. He went through each document without visible expression, the room quiet around him. Then Ev put the third thing on the table. It was a single sheet of paper folded once. He opened it and placed it flat. Ada had not seen it before. She looked at it. It was a joint claim filing the formal document for establishing co-ownership of water rights under Wyoming territorial law. 2 signatures at the bottom, Everett Wade and Ada Wade. The date was June 15, 1876, the same date as their marriage certificate. She looked at the date for a moment, and then she looked at him, and he was looking at her with the particular expression he had when he had done something he was not certain she would understand in the way he intended it. She understood. He had filed this on the morning they were married, not in response to the hearing, not as a legal strategy developed over weeks of preparation. He had gone from the justice of the peace's office to the county clerk's office on the same morning and filed both documents, the marriage and the joint claim, in the same sequence, as though they were 2 parts of the same decision, because they were. You did this the day we married, she said. She said it quietly for him only. I told you I needed a partner, not someone who worked for me. He looked at her steadily. That's what I meant. She held his gaze for a moment. She thought about a man who had washed the curtains before he left to get her, who had wound a stopped watch in the dark without being asked, who had said, I'm sorry you had to wait, instead of I'm sorry I was late, because the distinction mattered to him. She turned back to the table and let the hearing continue. Victor Crane was listening from across the room. He was a careful man and he was listening carefully, and Ada watched him as the judge reviewed the joint claim document, and she watched the specific moment when he understood the full shape of what he was looking at, not just the legal documentation, not just the corroborating records, but the particular fact that the woman sitting beside Ev Wade had been working on this case for 3 weeks, had identified the documentary gaps and filled them, and was now sitting with her hands folded on the table and her back straight, waiting with complete patience for the outcome of something she had done the work to earn. His expression did not change significantly. He was not a man who showed things easily. But there was a quality of stillness that came into him, the stillness of someone who was making a decision. He looked across the room, not at Ev, at Nell. Nell was watching everything with the seriousness she brought to everything important. Brown eyes, back straight, the misaligned buttons on the blue dress. 7 years old and attending a legal proceeding that was about her home, sitting between an old freight hauler and a boarding house owner, because those were the people who had come. Crane looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face changed, not dramatically, just a small adjustment, the kind that happens when a person is revising their own internal account of what they are doing and why. He had been a farmer in Kansas once before drought, and bad luck had remade him into something else. He had understood from the inside what it meant to lose land. He had believed genuinely, not cynically, that controlled water management was the right answer for this valley. But he was looking at a 7-year-old girl in a blue dress with 2 misaligned buttons, sitting very straight, because she understood this mattered, and he was finding unexpectedly that he could not make the arithmetic work in his favor anymore. He turned to his lead lawyer and spoke quietly. The lawyer looked up, looked at him, sucked back quietly. Crane shook his head slightly. The lawyer stood. Your Honor, the filing party wishes to withdraw its claim pending review of additional documentation. The room was quiet for a moment. The judge looked at Crane. Mr. Crane, this is a substantial proceeding to withdraw from at this stage. I'm aware, Crane said. The withdrawal stands. Outside the courthouse in the afternoon heat of Laramie's main street, when the proceedings had concluded and the neighbors had dispersed and Margaret had taken Nell to look at the dry goods window down the block, Crane came to stand beside Ev on the courthouse steps. He said, I didn't come here thinking I was the villain of this. Ev looked at him. I know you didn't. The plan was sound, economically. Maybe it was. The valley would benefit from controlled irrigation. Maybe it would. Ev shifted his weight on the crutch. But not like that. Not from someone else's water. Crane stood for a moment more. He looked down the street in the direction Nell had gone. He did not look like a man who had lost something he wanted. He looked like a man who had just narrowly avoided doing something he wouldn't have been able to put back. Your wife built that case, he said. She did. She's thorough. She is. Crane put on his hat. Good luck with the ranch, Wade. He walked down the steps and didn't look back. The road home was the same road they had taken to town, which looked different on the way back from the way it looked going. This was a quality of roads Ada had learned: the direction you're traveling changes what you notice. On the way to Laramie that morning, she had noticed the things that might go wrong. On the way home, she noticed Silver Creek at the bottom of the valley catching the afternoon light exactly the way it had caught it on the first evening she saw it. Nell had fallen asleep across the wagon bed behind them, her head on the folded canvas bag, her good dress acquiring the wrinkles of a day fully lived. Ev drove. Ada sat beside him. For a long time, neither of them said anything, and that was appropriate because neither of them needed to. The afternoon light changed from white to gold, and the road wound through juniper, and the horses kept their steady pace, and it was enough to be here moving through this in the direction of home. Oda, I'm listening. He kept his eyes on the horses. At Granger, when I stopped. He was quiet for a moment. I told you I was afraid you'd see everything and I wouldn't be enough. That was true, but there was something else. She waited. I thought about Grace, about how it felt to come home to a place where someone had been and wasn't anymore, about what it would mean to let someone into that place again, and then he stopped. I was afraid of what it would cost, not what I'd lose, what losing it would cost the second time. She looked at the road ahead, and yet you came, and yet I came, with the flower. With the flower. She thought about that for a while, about a man who understood exactly the price of the thing he was riding toward, who had sat in a roadside tavern and held that price in his hands and counted it and decided to pay it. Not because it was easy, because he had decided the alternative was worse. I was afraid too, she said. Not of the same thing, but afraid. Of what? She considered it honestly. That I had made a decision based on 12 letters in my own assessment of a man I'd never met, and that the assessment was wrong. That I had been precise and careful and correct in my analysis, and it still wouldn't be enough to know a person from their words alone. She paused. I was afraid I was wrong about you. Were you? She looked at his profile in the afternoon light, the scar along his jaw, the set of his shoulders, the hands that held the reins the same way they held everything, with enough grip to control, not so much as to force. No, she said, I was not wrong about you. He put his hand over hers where it rested on the wagon seat, not pressing, not asking for anything, just placing it there, the way you place something where it belongs when you are certain finally that it belongs there. Nell stirred behind them. Ada heard her gather herself in the particular way she had learned to recognize the small sounds that came before this child's waking, the shift of weight the breath held differently. She had learned to read them over these weeks, the way she had learned to read other things about this place, by paying close attention to what was actually happening. We're home, Nell said from the wagon bed, with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone reporting a fact that requires no embellishment. Ada turned to look at her. Nell had one eye open and was regarding the ranch with the possessive satisfaction of a child who has lived somewhere long enough to mean it when she calls it hers. We're home, Ada confirmed. Ev stopped the wagon. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. October came in the way Wyoming Octobers come all at once, with the particular quality of light that arrives when summer has made up its mind to leave, and the mountains go from green to amber to the first white at the peaks in the space of 2 weeks. Ada knew before she said anything. She had known for 3 weeks, had applied the same careful observation to her own symptoms that she would have applied to a patient, had arrived at the same conclusion through the same process, and had sat with the conclusion in the way she sat with most important things long enough to be certain, not so long that it became something she was carrying alone for reasons she couldn't justify. She told him after supper on a Tuesday evening, when Nell had gone to bed and the kitchen was quiet with the remains of the meal between them and the lamp burning low. She said it directly without preamble because she didn't know another way to say important things and had stopped trying to learn one. He was still for a while, long enough that she had a single coherent moment of wondering if she had misjudged this too. Then he stood up. He could do so without the crutch. Now the bone having healed in the clean way of bones that had been set correctly and given adequate TMN, he came around the table to where she was sitting, and he did something she had seen him do only once before with Nell, on the afternoon that they'd arrived home from Laramie, and he held her. He put his arms around her and held on without saying anything. She felt him breathe. Ev, I know. Are you? Last time, he said, with his face against her hair, I wasn't there. A pause. The creek outside in the October dark. This time I'll be there. She held that. She held the simplicity of it, the weight of the promise in 4 words from a man who did not make promises lightly and did not break them when he had made them. I know you will, she said. 15 years later, September 1891. Silver Creek Ranch, Wyoming, admitted to the Union as the 44th state the year before, a fact that Ev sometimes remembered when he signed official papers and found himself writing State of Wyoming, where he had written Territory for 27 years. It still felt slightly formal. The land itself hadn't changed. He was 50 years old. The dark hair had gone mostly silver now, particularly at the temples, which Nell told him suited him in the straightforward way she said most things. The scar along his jaw had faded from the white of healed tissue to something barely distinguishable from the surrounding skin. The legs still gave him trouble in cold weather, a deep ache that settled into the bone sometime in November, and stayed until March, but it carried him, and he had long since made his peace with the terms. Ada was 38. She moved through the ranch and the town and the work of her days with the same economy of motion she had brought off the train in Laramie in 1876, the same quality of attention that did not waste itself on things that didn't require it and gave fully to the things that did. Her hands were different now. The softness of Boston long since replaced by something more honest. The particular calluses of a woman who worked with both her mind and her hands and found no hierarchy between the two. On the desk in the small office she kept at the back of the house was a framed square of glass. Inside it, mounted on a backing of dark cloth, was a sunflower, dried to a pale shadow of its original color. Most of the petals long since returned to dust. The stem curved slightly with age. Beside it on the desk, the silver pocket watch running as it had run every day since the night Ev wound it 15 years ago now, in the long quiet of that summer before the court date, when two people had sat together in the dark and chosen without saying so not to be strangers anymore. She wound it every morning now. The first thing before the coffee. The second thing was the coffee. 2 cups. Always 2. She could not have told you precisely when it had stopped being a choice and become simply the shape of a morning any more than she could tell you the precise moment she had stopped being a woman who was assessing a situation and become a woman who was living her life. These things don't announce themselves. They accumulate. Nell was 22. She taught at the county school in Laramie, which she had decided on herself at 16 in the direct way she decided everything without asking permission and without appearing to doubt the decision once made. She had her mother's eyes and her father's jaw and some third quality that was entirely her own, a way of being present in a room that made the room aware of her without any effort on her part to achieve this. She came home on Sundays when the road allowed it and sat at the kitchen table and talked about her students with the particular passion of someone who has found what they are for. Her middle name was Ada. She had chosen this herself at 12 for reasons she had explained to no one and which no one had asked her to explain. Amos was 14. He had his grandfather's name, Dr. Henry Merritt, whose memory Ada had carried forward in the particular way she carried forward things she did not want to lose, and had Ev's quality of stillness combined with Ada's quality of precision, which produced in him something neither parent had predicted: a child who was genuinely excellent at waiting. He could sit a fence and watch a herd for 3 hours without apparent effort. He could let a problem sit unaddressed until he understood it fully. He was going to be good at this work. Ev saw it and didn't say it, which was how Ev showed that he saw things. Sella was 10. She had declared herself interested in medicine at the age of 7, with no clear antecedent and no encouragement from anyone, and had spent the 3 years since in a state of systematic self-education that Ada found both recognizable and humbling. She had read her way through every book in Ada's medical library. She asked questions that suggested she had understood what she'd read. She was, Ada thought, going to be better at this than she was, which was exactly the right outcome. The clinic in Laramie had been running for 4 years. Ada had opened it the year after Amos was born, in a single room above the dry goods store 2 days a week, because she was the only person within 30 miles who could set a bone correctly or recognize the early signs of childbed fever or manage a difficult delivery. And that fact, the pure practical weight of being needed, had eventually overcome whatever hesitation she had about practicing without formal credentials. Wyoming did not yet license women as physicians. She was not technically a physician. She was a woman who had trained for 10 years under one of the best diagnosticians in Boston, and people who needed help came to her and she helped them. 3 years in the community had raised enough through subscription and donation to bring a young doctor named Callum Grant West from Denver. He was 28, newly trained, excellent in theory, and considerably less experienced in practice. And he had been smart enough to recognize this and to sit with Ada for the first 6 months and learn from someone who knew what she was doing. They worked together now, his credentials, her knowledge, the combination serving the valley in ways that neither alone could have managed. The clinic was not large. It was not grand. What it was open. That afternoon, which was a Sunday in late September, Nell had come home and was sitting with Ada on the front porch in the way she sat on Sunday afternoons, comfortably without agenda, watching the light change on the creek. Amos and Sella were somewhere in the vicinity of the south pasture, audible in occasional bursts of the kind of laughter that suggests someone is being chased. Ev was at the barn doing something with Amos's horse, that required concentration and the kind of solitude that had always suited him. "Can I ask you something?" Nell said. "Yes." "Do you ever regret the 4 days in Laramie?" Ada looked at the creek. The afternoon light was doing the thing it did in September, coming in lower and longer, turning the grass from gold to amber, catching the water at the angle that made the name still make sense after 15 years. She took her time with the question. "It deserved that." "The first morning," she said, "I got off the train and there was no brown vest and no sunflower and no one who knew his name. And I thought, with the particular clarity of someone who has just done something irreversible and is looking at the gap between the plan and the reality, that I had possibly made a significant error." "Were you frightened?" "I was precise," Ada said. "That's what I do when I'm frightened. I get more precise." Nell smiled at this in the way she smiled at things she recognized. "By the third day, I had a number, $4.30. I had a timeline. I had a decision point. I had given myself one more day, and the one more day was the last one, and I was sitting with that." Ada paused. "If he had arrived on time, I would have met him at the platform in the way you meet someone at a platform when everything has gone according to the plan. Civil, practical, beginning a transaction. But he didn't arrive on time. He didn't arrive on time. He arrived bruised 4 days late with a dead flower, having ridden through 2 days of rain and one night in a roadside tavern where he had seriously considered not coming at all. And he came anyway. And he came anyway." She looked at the water for a moment. "What I met on that platform was not a man presenting himself at his best. It was a man showing me exactly who he was when things were hard. There is no more honest version of a person than that." Nell was quiet. "So no," Ada said. "I don't regret the 4 days. The 4 days were the story. Without them, I might have married someone adequate. With them, I married him." Down at the barn, she could hear the sound of Ev's voice, low, unhurried, the particular register he used with horses and children, and occasionally with her in the early mornings when the house was still quiet. Amos appeared from the direction of the south pasture at a run, Sella 3 steps behind him, both of them heading for the barn, with the urgency of children who have found something interesting and need a parent to confirm that it is as interesting as they think. Ev came out of the barn door to meet them. He had his hat off and his sleeves rolled, and the look of a man who has been interrupted in the middle of something and does not mind being interrupted. He bent down to hear what Amos was saying. He listened with the full attention he brought to things worth listening to. Then he looked up across the yard to where Ada sat on the porch. He didn't call to her. He didn't wave. He looked at her in the way he had looked at her for 15 years, the look that said, "I see you. I am here. I am still here." And then he turned back to the children and whatever emergency they had discovered in the south pasture. Nell was watching her watch him. "He still does that," Nell said quietly. "Every day. Looks at you like that. Every day." Ada picked up her coffee cup, which had gone cold, and held it in both hands. "I used to think it was something he did deliberately, something he decided to do. But I've watched him long enough to know it isn't. It's just how he orients, the way a compass orients. He points at what matters to him." Nell looked at the yard for a moment, at her father and her siblings and the barn and the creek and the mountains going amber in the distance, at the particular ordinary shape of an afternoon that was also in every way that counted extraordinary. "I want that," she said, simply without self-pity, in the manner of someone naming a fact. "I know," Ada said. "Don't settle for less." From inside the house, the kitchen clock struck 4. It was a good clock, solid and reliable, purchased from a clockmaker in Laramie the year Amos was born. It kept excellent time. On Ada's desk in the office off the kitchen, the silver pocket watch kept its own time, running as it had run every day since the night a man in a dark room had decided that something stopped her for too long was worth winding again. 15 years of mornings. 15 years of 2 cups, always 2. 15 years of the creek running silver in the late light, going where it had always been going. Ev came across the yard with Amos and Sella trailing behind him, the 3 of them discussing something that required considerable hand gestures from all parties. He came up the porch steps and looked at Ada and Nell sitting in the late sun, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who has come home to a thing he knows the value of because he has also stood at the edge of not having it and felt the weight of that gap. He went inside. The screen door settled behind him. A moment later, from the kitchen, the sound of the stove. The particular sound of a man who knows where things are in a kitchen because he has lived in it for 15 years, setting the coffee on without being asked because the afternoon was cooling, and he knew without being told that cold coffee on a cooling afternoon was not what was wanted. 2 cups. There would be 2 cups. There were always 2 cups. Nell looked at Ada. Ada looked at the mountains. The creek ran on in the valley below, the same creek it had always been, silver in the late light, unhurried, going where it was always going. They had stopped running, both of them. That was all. And that was enough.